The temperature outside was 11 degrees, my pipes were groaning like a dying moose, and there, taped to my front door in a plastic sleeve like it was some kind of eviction notice, was a violation letter about my garden hose. Not the hose itself, the cover. The little foam dome thing you slip over an outdoor spigot so it doesn't freeze and burst in the middle of January. Mine was black. Apparently black was against code. I'm Aaron Sullivan, and I've lived in Frostmill Ridge for 6 years. Before that winter, I thought the worst thing our HOA could do was complain about my mailbox post leaning 2 degrees to the left. I was wrong. Dead wrong. Because that year, the HOA board decided that a $2 foam hose bib cover from the hardware store was a threat to the architectural integrity of the entire neighborhood. And the woman behind it, as always, was Kathy Blankenship. Kathy was in her early 50s, drove a white Lexus SUV with an HOA board member parking placard she'd made herself, not actually authorized, I later found out, and treated the Frostmill Ridge Homeowners Association like her personal kingdom. She'd been on the board for 11 years. 11 years of writing herself little rules, bending big ones, and making everyone else's life miserable in the name of community standards. I pulled the notice off my door with numb fingers and read it twice just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from the cold. Violation: non-approved exterior fixture cover, hose bib insulator. Homeowner is required to remove said item and replace with board-approved model within 10 days or face daily fines of $25. There is, and I want to stress this, no such thing as a board-approved hose bib cover. I called the management company. I called the architectural committee line. Nobody had ever heard of an approved model. Nobody could send me a picture of one, a part number, a catalog, anything. It was a rule that existed only in Kathy Blankenship's head, freshly invented, apparently, on the coldest week of the year. I want you to understand something about that week. It was brutal. Ice on the road so thick that 3 cars slid into the ditch on Cedar Loop alone. My neighbor's propane tank ran low because the delivery truck couldn't get up our hill for 2 days. Half the street had space heaters running, breakers popping, furnaces wheezing. People were worried about frozen pipes, dead batteries, black ice on their driveways. And Kathy Blankenship was out there, in a parka with fake fur trim, walking the neighborhood with a clipboard, photographing hose bibs. I should have known something like this was coming. 2 weeks earlier at the December HOA meeting, Kathy had stood up and announced, completely straight-faced, that the board was reviewing exterior weatherproofing accessories for consistency with community aesthetic standards. Half the room laughed, thinking she meant Christmas lights. She did not mean Christmas lights. She meant hose bib covers. I'll be honest, my first instinct was to just take the thing off and put a new one on, whatever, not worth the fight. It's foam, it costs $2, but then the fine structure caught my eye. $25 a day, no grace period beyond the 10 days. And worse, buried in fine print, failure to comply may result in HOA performing corrective action at homeowner's expense, minimum $150 service fee. That's when the alarm bells really went off, because I'd heard that story before about 6 other houses in the neighborhood. HOA corrective action always seemed to cost way more than the actual problem, and it always seemed to line up suspiciously well with a landscaping and handyman company that, as it turned out later, Kathy's brother-in-law happened to run. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That first night, I just sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold, staring at the notice, feeling that particular flavor of rage you only get from bureaucratic nonsense. My wife, Denise, was out of town visiting her sister, so it was just me and our dog Biscuit in the house, and Biscuit was zero help, mostly because he was asleep on the heating vent like it owed him money. I decided right then I wasn't just going to comply. I was going to find out exactly where this approved list came from, and why, out of every house on Chestnut Court, mine was the one that got a notice. The next morning I bundled up, grabbed my phone, and did a lap of the neighborhood. Frostmill Ridge has about 40 houses, and it took me less than 15 minutes to spot at least a dozen hose bib covers. Foam domes, plastic ones. One guy even had an actual insulated faucet cover shaped like a tiny doghouse, which honestly was kind of charming. None of them matched mine. None of them matched each other. If there really was an approved cover, the entire neighborhood was violating it except, apparently, nobody but me had gotten a notice. I took pictures of every single one, time-stamped, geotagged, the works. I'm not a lawyer, but I've dealt with enough contractor disputes in my job. I do commercial insurance underwriting, so I know my way around documentation. To know that inconsistency is the HOA's biggest weakness. If they enforce a rule on one house and not others, that's the crack you drive a truck through. While I was out there, camera in hand, I ran into my neighbor Gary Petrov, who was salting his driveway in a Carhartt jacket and a knit hat with the world's saddest pom-pom. "You get the hose thing too?" he asked, not even looking up from his salt spreader. "You got one?" "Yeah, mine's the green foam kind, same as always." Kathy said it clashes with the winter palette of the community. "There's a winter palette. Apparently it's beige and white and nothing else." He shook his head. "This woman has too much time on her hands." "You planning on fighting it?" Gary laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Fighting the HOA is like fighting a raccoon in your attic. You might win, but you're gonna get bit and it's gonna cost you a fortune in exterminator fees either way. I'm just gonna swap the cover." I understood that mentality. Most people did. That's exactly why Kathy Blankenship had gotten away with this kind of thing for over a decade. Because most reasonable people looked at the cost-benefit of fighting City Hall, or in this case Kathy Hall, and decided it wasn't worth the headache. But something about this particular violation had lit a fuse in me. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was the sheer audacity of inventing a rule out of thin air during a cold snap when people had actual emergencies to deal with. Maybe it was just that I'd had enough. I went home, made a fresh pot of coffee, and started digging through the HOA's governing documents, the CC and RS, the bylaws, all the stuff nobody reads until they desperately need to. I found the section on exterior modifications requiring architectural approval. It talked about paint colors, fencing, roofing materials, landscaping changes. Nowhere, in any version of the documents going back to when the neighborhood was built in the early 2000s, was there a single word about hose bib covers, which meant Kathy had made up an entire violation category out of nothing. I called the property management company again, a woman named Renata who sounded perpetually exhausted, like she'd been fielding Kathy-related complaints since the dawn of time. "Mr. Sullivan, I understand your frustration, but the board does have some discretion under the aesthetic consistency clause," she said. "Can you send me the approved list?" A long pause. "There isn't an official published list at this time, so there's no list. There's a list Mrs. Blankenship keeps. In her house." "I believe so, yes." I actually laughed out loud at that. A literal handwritten list, kept by one woman, dictating what garden hose accessories 40 families were allowed to use, with fines attached for noncompliance, and apparently zero oversight from the actual management company that was supposed to be running things. "Can you get me a copy?" "I'll try to reach out to her." I had a feeling try to reach out meant never going to happen, and I was right. 3 days passed. No list. No further contact. Just the fine clock ticking down. On day 4, the doorbell rang, and there she was. Kathy Blankenship in her parka, clipboard in hand, breath steaming in the 11-degree air, standing on my porch like she owned it. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, in that tone people use when they're pretending to be pleasant but are actually thrilled to be delivering bad news. "I noticed you haven't complied with the notice yet." "Kathy, hi. I've actually got some questions about that." "It's Mrs. Blankenship when we're discussing board business." I decided right then that I would call her Kathy for the rest of this conversation and every conversation after, but I let that slide for the moment. "Sure. So I looked through the CC and RS and I can't find anything about hose bib covers. Can you point me to the section?" She sniffed, actual sniff, like I'd personally offended her by asking a reasonable question. It falls under aesthetic consistency, Section 14. Section 14 is about fencing materials. It's a broad interpretation. Is there an approved list I can see? I have it at home. Can you send me a copy? I don't typically distribute my personal records. They're not personal records if they're being used to fine me $25 a day, Kathy. Her jaw tightened at the Kathy, which told me I'd found a button worth pressing. The board has full authority to set community standards. If you don't comply within the remaining time frame, we'll have no choice but to send someone out to replace it, and you'll be billed accordingly. Billed by who? A qualified vendor. Does this vendor happen to be related to you? Her eyes flickered just for a half second, but it was enough. I don't see how that's relevant. It's relevant if the HOA board is directing business to a family member without disclosing the conflict of interest, which, last I checked, is something the State Real Estate Commission takes pretty seriously for HOA governance. She actually took a step back on my porch, nearly slipping on a patch of ice I probably should have salted better, and for one glorious second I thought she might actually fall. She didn't. She caught the railing, glared at me, and said, "I'll be noting this conversation for the record," and marched back to her Lexus. I went inside, poured myself a very large mug of coffee, and started making calls. First call was to a friend of mine, Marcus, who's a real estate attorney I'd worked with on a couple of underwriting cases. He didn't handle HOA stuff exclusively, but he knew people who did, and more importantly, he knew the law. "So here's the thing," Marcus said after I explained the situation. "HOAs generally do have some leeway on aesthetic rules, but that leeway has to come from properly adopted rules that get recorded and distributed to homeowners. A rule that exists only in one board member's head, that's never been voted on by the full board, never been noticed to homeowners, and isn't written anywhere in the governing documents. That's not enforceable. That's just her making things up. So if I ignore it, if she tries to fine you for violating a rule that doesn't legally exist, you could dispute every fine in writing, demand it go to the full board for a vote, and if they still try to collect, you could take it to small claims or file a complaint with the state. Depends on your state's HOA statutes, but a lot of states now require HOAs to follow proper rulemaking procedures, public notice, board votes, recorded amendments. If she skipped all that, she's exposed. And the vendor thing, the corrective action fee going to her brother-in-law's company, that's the part I'd actually worry about for her, not you. That's a conflict of interest issue, potentially self-dealing. If she's been doing this on other violations too, directing business to a related party without disclosure, that could be a breach of her fiduciary duty to the association. Depending on dollar amounts, some of that could even cross into something the state's willing to prosecute, especially if there's a pattern. I felt something settle in my chest, that specific calm that comes when you realize you're not the crazy one in the situation. "I want you to write something up," I said, "a demand letter, and I want to talk to some other homeowners first, see if this has happened to anyone else." That week between working from home and dodging icy patches on my own driveway, I made it my mission to talk to as many of my neighbors as I could. It turned out to be easier than expected, because half the neighborhood was outside anyway, dealing with winter chaos, busted gutters from ice dams, cars that wouldn't start, one poor guy on Birchwood whose heat pump had frozen solid and needed an emergency repair guy who charged him double for an after-hours winter call. In the middle of all that legitimate winter misery, Kathy Blankenship had apparently been busy handing out notices for the dumbest possible infractions. I found out that Mrs. Ferraro on Elm had gotten a notice for her snow shovel being visible from the street for more than 24 hours after a snowfall. Apparently, leaving your shovel leaning against your garage was now an aesthetic violation. The Ahmeds on Cedar had gotten dinged for a blue tarp over their firewood pile, even though it gets covered every single winter and nobody had ever said a word before. And a retired couple, the Whitfields, had gotten a notice about their unauthorized ice melt product. Apparently, Kathy decided that using a certain brand of rock salt was corrosive to community sidewalks and demanded they switch to a specific, more expensive, eco-friendly brand, which, you guessed it, happened to be sold through a little side business her daughter ran out of their garage. Every single one of these notices had that same vague language. May result in HOA performing corrective action at homeowner's expense. Every single one pointed, in some roundabout way, back to a business owned by someone in Kathy's family. This wasn't just an overzealous busybody anymore. This was a pattern, a racket basically dressed up in HOA letterhead. I started a spreadsheet. I know, very exciting, a spreadsheet, but stay with me because that spreadsheet is exactly what ended up sinking her. I logged every notice I could find, who received it, the date, the alleged violation, the fine amount, and any mention of a vendor or corrective action provider. I cross-referenced business names with public business registration records, which, in my state, are public record online. Sure enough, the landscaping and handyman services company doing HOA corrective actions was registered to a Daniel Reyes. A little more digging on social media, and there he was, tagged in photos at a Blankenship family barbecue, arm around Kathy, captioned 4th of July with the fam. Daniel Reyes, Kathy's brother-in-law. The ice melt business was registered under Blankenship Blooms LLC, owned by one Ashley Blankenship, Kathy's daughter. I sat back in my chair, stunned by how sloppy this all was. She hadn't even bothered to hide it well. I think 11 years of nobody pushing back had made her sloppy, comfortable, convinced that nobody would ever bother checking. Now, I want to be clear, none of this would have mattered if the actual HOA board, the other 4 members, had been complicit. So my next move was figuring out how much they actually knew. I called Denise that night to fill her in, since she'd been getting updates the whole week and was fully invested at this point. "You're telling me," she said, laughing over the phone, "that we are potentially going to bring down an entire corrupt HOA regime because of a $2 foam hose cover. When you put it that way, it does sound a little dramatic." "It sounds amazing. Please keep going. I want updates every day." The following Tuesday was the monthly HOA board meeting, held at the community clubhouse, a slightly rundown building with a leaky roof that the HOA had somehow never gotten around to fixing despite years of dues increases. But that's a story for another day. I decided that was where I'd bring everything to light. I printed out my spreadsheet. I printed photos of the dozen non-compliant hose bib covers around the neighborhood that had never received a single notice. I printed the business registration records. I printed screenshots of Daniel Reyes and Ashley Blankenship's family ties. Marcus helped me draft a short, clean statement, the kind you can read out loud in under 3 minutes without sounding like a crazy person waving papers around, even though that's basically what I was about to do. The meeting room was packed that night, more than I'd ever seen before. Word travels fast in a neighborhood, especially when half of Chestnut Court has spent the week getting nonsense violation notices during a cold snap that's already stressed everybody out. Gary Petrov was there. Mrs. Ferraro was there, bundled up in a coat that looked warmer than my furnace. The Ahmeds, the Whitfields. Even people I barely knew from the far side of the neighborhood, near the entrance gate, had shown up. Kathy sat at the head table with the other 4 board members. The HOA president, a quiet guy named Todd Larson, who mostly just nodded along with whatever Kathy said. The treasurer, an older woman named Pat Chen, who actually looked a little uncomfortable every time Kathy opened her mouth. And 2 others, Rick and Deb, who I'd honestly never heard say more than 3 words at any meeting in 6 years. Kathy ran through the usual boring agenda items: landscaping contract renewal, pool opening dates months away, but sure, a reminder about holiday decoration removal deadlines. Then she got to new violations and compliance updates, and I raised my hand. "Before we move on," I said, standing up, I'd like to bring something to the board's attention regarding the hose bib cover violations issued this week. Kathy's expression did this thing where it tried to stay neutral, but her eyes narrowed just slightly, like a poker player who just got dealt a bad card but was determined not to show it. Mr. Sullivan, if you have a personal dispute about your violation, that's handled through the appeals process, not open floor discussion. It's not just my violation. It's a pattern, and I think the board deserves to see the full picture before you approve any more corrective action fees. Todd Larson, looking a little startled to have actual responsibility land on him, said, "Go ahead, let's hear it." I walked to the front, laid out my printed pages on the table, and started talking. I kept it simple, factual, no yelling, no drama, just, here's the rule that doesn't exist in any governing document. Here are 12 houses with non-compliant covers that got 0 notices. Here's my house, the one that did get a notice. Here's the business that would have profited from corrective action, registered to Kathy's brother-in-law. Here's the same pattern with the SALT notices pointing to Kathy's daughter's business. Here's the same pattern with at least 2 other violations issued this same week. The room got very, very quiet, the good kind of quiet where you can feel everyone leaning forward. Pat Chen picked up one of my printouts, the business registration one, and stared at it for a long moment. "Kathy," she said slowly, "is this true? Is Daniel your brother-in-law?" "That is completely irrelevant," Kathy snapped, a little too fast, a little too loud. "The board sets standards, and homeowners are responsible for compliance regardless of who happens to provide corrective services." "But you're the one who decides who's non-compliant," Gary Petrov called out from the crowd, "and apparently you decided that pretty selectively." "I don't appreciate being ambushed like this," Kathy said, standing up now, gripping the edge of the table. "Nobody's ambushing you," I said. "I called the management company for a week trying to get a copy of this approved list you keep mentioning. Nobody could produce it, because it doesn't exist anywhere except, apparently, in a notebook at your house." "The board has discretion. The board," Pat Chen interrupted, and I could tell she'd had enough, "votes on things. As a board, did we vote on a hose bib cover policy? Because I don't remember that. Did we vote on an approved ice melt brand? Because I definitely don't remember that either." Silence. Kathy's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "I was handling it under general aesthetic authority," she finally said. "Boards do this all the time, streamlining minor decisions so we don't waste meeting time on trivial things." "Fining someone $25 a day isn't trivial," Mrs. Ferraro said from the crowd. "And you gave my shovel a violation notice." "My shovel, Kathy. I leaned it against my own garage for a day after clearing my driveway during a storm most people were still stuck in traffic for." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Someone near the back muttered something about power trip, loud enough for half the room to hear and chuckle. Todd Larson cleared his throat, looking deeply uncomfortable with his sudden promotion to person who has to handle this. "I think," he said slowly, "given what's been presented, we need to suspend all pending corrective action fees related to these specific violations until the board can review the full history of decisions Kathy has made on her own. That includes my brother's business." Came a voice from the crowd. It was Daniel Ray's actual sister, apparently a resident too, who I hadn't even realized was in the room until that moment, looking mortified. "Everything," Todd said. Kathy's face had gone through several colors at this point, landing somewhere between furious and cornered raccoon. "This is a witch hunt," she said. "I have dedicated 11 years of unpaid time to this community, keeping standards up, keeping property values high, and this is the thanks I get. Some homeowner with a grudge over a garden hose." "It's not a grudge," I said. "It's a paper trail. And honestly, Kathy, if you just answered the phone when I asked for the approved list, none of this would have happened. I wasn't trying to take you down. I just wanted to know why my foam hose cover was suddenly illegal." That got a laugh from the room, a real one, breaking the tension just slightly. Pat Chen looked at the other board members. I move that we table all further discretionary violation notices issued solely by one board member without full board approval, effective immediately, pending a formal review. Second, said Rick, who I genuinely didn't know could talk. All in favor, 4 hands went up. Kathy's did not. Motion passes, Todd said. Kathy, I think we need to schedule an emergency session to go over your independent decisions over the past few years. That was the moment the whole meeting sort of dissolved into controlled chaos, people standing up, talking over each other, Mrs. Ferraro loudly demanding her shovel violation be formally rescinded and apologized for, the Ahmeds asking about their TARP notice, the Whitfields wanting to know if they could get reimbursed for the fancy ice melt they'd already bought under duress. Kathy stormed out before the meeting even officially ended, Lexus tires spinning slightly on the icy parking lot as she peeled away, which, given the black ice everywhere that week, was honestly a little concerning, but she made it out fine, unfortunately robbing me of a satisfying ditch moment. The emergency session happened the following week. I wasn't allowed to attend the closed portion, obviously, since it dealt with personnel matters regarding a sitting board member, but Pat Chen gave me the summary afterward over coffee at the little diner near the entrance to Frostmill Ridge. Turns out, once they started actually digging, it wasn't just the hose bib covers and the ice melt. Kathy had been quietly steering the HOA's landscaping contract renewal toward a company 2 doors down from Daniel Ray's handyman business. Same building even, though registered under a different name to make it less obvious. She'd been approving emergency tree removal work at inflated rates for trees that, upon inspection by an actual arborist the board finally hired, weren't dead or diseased at all, just inconveniently placed near a property she happened to personally dislike the look of. She'd unilaterally fined at least 6 other households for invented violations over the past 2 years, all of which pointed back to some family-adjacent vendor. The dollar amount, once Pat and the treasurer's assistant tallied everything, came to just over $11,000 in fines and corrective action fees that had gone to businesses connected to Kathy's family over roughly 18 months. That's when the board's attorney, a real one, hired specifically for this mess, not just my buddy Marcus giving free advice over the phone anymore, advised them that this had crossed from bad HOA governance into potential breach of fiduciary duty and self-dealing under state HOA law, which, depending on how the DA's office wanted to handle it, could open Kathy up to civil liability at minimum, and possibly a criminal referral for fraud given the pattern and dollar amount. The board voted unanimously, even Todd, who I think finally found a spine somewhere in a closet to remove Kathy Blankenship from the HOA board immediately, demand repayment of all improperly collected fees, and refer the matter to both their attorney and, separately, the County Consumer Protection Division, since HOA fraud involving vendor kickbacks is exactly the kind of thing that division investigates. I found out later, through the neighborhood grapevine, mostly Gary Petrov, who apparently knew someone who knew someone at the county office, that Kathy tried to argue her way out of it, claiming she was simply protecting community standards, and had no idea her family members' businesses happened to benefit from her decisions, an argument that fell apart the second investigators pulled work orders showing she'd personally approved payments to those same businesses, sometimes above market rate. Multiple times over 2 years. The county ended up charging her with a handful of things: official misconduct related to her fiduciary role, and something related to fraud given the pattern of directing fees to undisclosed related parties. I'm not a lawyer, so I won't pretend I fully understood every charge, but the short version, according to Marcus, was she wasn't just an annoying HOA lady anymore. She was a defendant. She ended up taking a plea deal rather than going to trial, paying back the $11,000 plus fees, doing some community service, which, In an ironic twist nobody in the neighborhood got tired of joking about, involved actual manual labor, not paperwork, and permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in the state for a set number of years. The best part, though, genuinely the best part, happened about a month after that first meeting, once winter had eased up just enough that the roads weren't a constant ice rink anymore. The new interim board, with Pat Chen stepping up as president since Todd, bless him, admitted he never really wanted the job and had just been too passive to say no for years, held an open community meeting to formally apologize to everyone who'd been hit with bogus fines. Every single fine was reversed. Every dollar was refunded, some directly by the HOA reserve fund, some clawed back from Kathy as part of her settlement. And me. My original hose bib violation, the one that started this whole mess. Formally and permanently dismissed in writing on actual HOA letterhead, with a line that Pat Chen added just for fun. No further violation exists, nor has one ever legitimately existed, regarding exterior hose bib insulation covers of any color, material, or design, so long as they function to prevent pipe freezing during winter months. I actually framed that letter. It hangs in my garage now, right above the shelf where I keep my extra hose bib covers, which, for the record, are still black, still foam, still $2 from the hardware store, and still doing exactly what they're supposed to do, keeping my pipes from freezing during a brutal winter. The neighborhood held its own little informal gathering that spring, once the snow finally melted and the ice finally stopped threatening to send everyone's cars into the ditch. Nothing official, no board involvement, just neighbors setting up a couple of grills in the cul-de-sac, kids running around, Biscuit getting way too many table scraps from people who felt like he deserved a treat for being the dog of the guy who took down Kathy. Which generous, since Biscuit's biggest contribution to the whole ordeal was sleeping on a heating vent the entire time. Gary Petrov raised a can of soda at one point, in a mock toast. To the hose bib cover, he said, the $2 piece of foam that took down a corrupt regime. Everyone laughed, clinked their cans and cups together, and for the first time in a long time, Frostmill Ridge actually felt like a community instead of a place where you nervously checked your mailbox for violation notices. The new board under Pat Chen actually did something almost unheard of. They held a real vote, publicized to every homeowner, on an actual, official, written list of approved exterior weatherproofing accessories, including hose bib covers, in every reasonable color and material, because, as Pat put it during the meeting, if it keeps your pipes from bursting in a Midwest winter, I genuinely do not care what color it is. They also added a new rule, one I actually helped draft language for since Marcus walked me through the legal phrasing. No board member could approve corrective action vendors without disclosing any personal or familial relationship, and all corrective action contracts over a certain dollar amount required competitive bidding and full board approval, not just one person's signature. It wasn't a perfect system after that, because no HOA ever really is, but it was fair, transparent, and blessedly boring, which, when it comes to homeowners associations, might be the highest compliment you can give. As for Kathy Blankenship, last I heard, she moved out of Frostmill Ridge entirely, selling her house sometime in early summer to a young family who, as far as I know, have never once received a violation notice for anything, hose bib covers or otherwise. I don't know where she went. Part of me hopes it's somewhere without an HOA at all, so she can finally understand what it's like to just live somewhere without inventing rules to make other people's lives harder. Part of me hopes it's somewhere with an even stricter HOA than ours, one that fines her constantly for things that don't exist, just so she can experience exactly what she put this neighborhood through for over a decade. Either way, every winter now, when the first cold snap hits and I'm out there wrapping my hose bibs in their perfectly legal, perfectly boring foam covers, I think back to that ridiculous week when a $2 piece of foam somehow exposed an entire scheme of fraud, favoritism, and fake rules, and I can't help but smile. Because sometimes the smallest, dumbest fights are exactly the ones worth having. And sometimes, the HOA lady with the clipboard and the fake parking placard isn't just annoying. Sometimes she's hiding something a lot bigger behind that laminated violation notice. You just have to be willing to check. Denise still brings it up sometimes, usually right around the first snowfall of the year, when she sees me heading outside with my toolbox to winterize the pipes. "You sure that cover's on the approved list?" she'll ask, grinning. "Made the list myself," I tell her every time. "Had it notarized and everything." It's a joke now, a good one, the kind that gets funnier every year instead of getting old, because every single person on our street knows exactly what it means. It means we're not scared of a clipboard anymore. It means if someone tries to invent a rule out of thin air again, we know exactly what to do. Document everything, ask the right questions, and never, ever assume the person with the most confidence is the person who's actually right. Frostmill Ridge got its fair HOA. I got my letter framed in the garage. And somewhere out there, Kathy Blankenship is probably still trying to figure out how a foam hose bib cover managed to end her decade-long reign of terror. $2 well spent if you ask me.